All right, in the interest of time, we might get started. So thanks everyone for joining the last session for today. Today we're going to be talking about carbon pricing in the maritime sector. So my name is Joe Pryor, I'm a Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank, and I'm the moderator for today. And we've got some esteemed panelists, but before I introduce, I just want to give a little bit of context and background for today's session. So the maritime sector is obviously really important for economic progress. Shipping is the backbone of international trade. And is essentially the vehicle or the mechanism for countries to be able to access the raw materials and inputs to essentially enable economic progress. However, shipping, international shipping included, is an important contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. The IMO estimates that around almost 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from shipping activities, which is actually more than some economies emit, so it's important. So therefore, tackling greenhouse gas emissions from this sector, and international shipping in particular, is critical, but it's tricky. And it's tricky for a couple of reasons. And the first reason is international shipping falls outside operational control of governments and sits outside of the Paris Agreement. And the second reason why it's tricky is that the options available to reduce emissions are relatively limited compared to some other sectors. And so while technologies and fuels exist to reduce emissions, commercializing them and rolling them out can be complex and can take time. So this really spells out the policy dilemma facing policymakers, but also some of the challenges for specific instruments like carbon pricing in terms of trying to drive change. But there has been progress, and so people are aware of what's happened in the last few years, including the EU ETS, which now applies to shipping from this year. And the IMO has been trying to progress and is developing an economic instrument to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. And it's expected to enter into force in 2027. So the purpose of today is to try and talk a little bit about the potential for carbon pricing in the shipping industry, try and take stock of where we are and talk about some challenges, opportunities, and some future prospects. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. And we're very lucky because we have 4 experts, but they're all from very different parts of the sector. So I think we can get some unique perspectives as we start to discuss. So first of all, Domagoj Barisic, who's a research fellow at the UCL Institute, Maaike Brugels, who's the deputy director at the Dutch Emissions Authority, Martin Keynes, who's a senior researcher at the Okyo Institute, and Sarah Tukel, who's the Maritime Group Sustainability Director at Arcus Line, Turkey. So I'm going to ask 3 rounds of questions, and then we'll see if there's time left to go to the audience for follow-up questions. Now, my first question is a bit of an easy one to sort of tell a bit about your background, but to try and make it a little bit more interesting and to sort of hear your different perspectives. It would be useful to hear what you think the role carbon pricing is or should be in the maritime sector. So maybe I'll start off with Domagoj.
Thank you, Joseph. And thank you. So, quick intro about myself. So, I'm Domagoj Barisic. I'm a research fellow at the UCL Energy Institute based in London. A lot of my work deals with fuel transitions in shipping and that decarbonization transition. How do we get there? So, I created some indicators to track progress towards that transition together with my colleagues, and we have a transition strategy and work closely with following progress at the IMO, International Maritime Organization, with regard to that. So regarding the question about what is the role really of carbon pricing in this transition, what can it play really from that perspective, I think there's 3 main aspects that I would cover. I'd say first of all, it's about narrowing that price gap in the early years. So can carbon pricing actually support narrowing the price gap between alternative fuels, as we like to call them, scalable zero-emission fuels, and existing fossil fuels in the industry? Now, to an extent, it can play that role, although the fuel standard will probably substitute that to a great extent. The other 2 aspects that I would say are quite important is where carbon pricing can play an important role is from the revenue that's actually collected from the carbon pricing scheme. And that's to ensure a just and equitable transition, number 1, and number 2, to actually support the adoption of those fuels or the adoption of that transition. Now, in both cases, you can use that revenue to actually support perhaps disproportionate and negative impacts on states, to support developments, to support climate mitigation, in that way perhaps ensuring just and equitable, but also especially in the early years, using that revenue to create that fueling or bunkering infrastructure, to support that R&D development, and to support other avenues of scaling up or that diffusion phase of those fuels that you can actually ensure they're adopted as rapidly as possible. Because what the IMO has shown in its 2023 GHG strategy, we want to ensure that by 2030, we have at least 5 to 10% of zero or near zero greenhouse gas fuels and technologies as part of the shipping fuel mix. In order for that to happen, funding is key. So I think that's where a lot of that can happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Micah, same question.
Thank you, Joey, and thank you all for the audience, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Maaike Breukels, and I work for the Dutch Emission Authority, and we implement the EU ETS now for almost 20 years. So we have quite some experience in implementing and experience with the MRV issues, etc. And as it is said on several stages, I guess, today, the EU ETS is one of the pillars of the European climate policy, and it's also quite successful. It decreased CO2 reductions by, I think it's about 40% compared to 2005. And I think, well, as the Commission has expanded its ETS to the maritime sector, it will be put under the cap of the same EU ETS. Meaning that all these shipping companies has to pay for their CO2 and pay in ETS allowances as from today on, 2024. It will be phased in, so it will be a bit gradual. Maybe you'll find it not so gradual. For this year, the shipping companies need to pay their allowances for about 40%, and it will be in 2 steps to 100% in 2027. And I think, but that's the opinion of our authority, and I agree with what is said on several stages as well. This puts a long-term ambition and clarity to the sector. So, although I don't think pricing is the only instrument, I think this will help.
Excellent, thank you. Now, I might just jump to Sarah because you touched on a little bit in terms of whether or not it was a slow and steady introduction. And I know, Sarah, that you've had a lot of experience with MRV for the last couple of years as a compliance entity. So, interested to hear your perspective on how that's going and also what you see the role of carbon pricing in the shipping industry.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you all. I'm really sorry for my voice. I just lost it today. So I try to make it as clear as possible. This is Sarah Tükel. I'm the Sustainability Director for I4C Maritime Group. We operate 51 vessels, which are also subject to EU ETS as of this year. And I'm in charge of setting our ESG strategy and decarbonization strategy for the coming period. So what I can tell, I have a commercial background, and I was in the pricing and selling of container transport throughout these past 20 years, 2 decades. And I believe that it's quite important to have a price on carbon for the maritime emissions. So this is quite critical, and this is actually putting I believe it's good pressure on the industry so that we move ahead now, because I mean the measures were there. We were already doing EU MRV since 2018. The reporting, the monitoring, reporting and verification was already there. But without this extra cost, additional cost, I think the change would be much slower. Now, I agree with Maaike. I think it's still a smooth transition with 40%. Then next year we will be responsible to pay 70% of our carbon emissions, and 100% will come in. Maybe I will talk about the challenges together with the IMO regulations later on, but what I can tell that, I mean, this is surely, this surely encourages the ship owners to use cleaner fuels earlier than before. So it advances our projections.
Thank you. So Martin, maybe there's all the points are being covered, but I don't know if you can offer a different perspective. On the,
yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'm with Öko-Institute, and I'm involved with greenhouse gas reduction in the maritime sector for almost 20 years. And the important thing here is that needs to be mentioned that carbon pricing is not a new idea for maritime transport. So already, I think at the MEPC I presented in 2008 the idea of introducing emission trading in the maritime sector, and then the IMO tried to develop policy, market-based policy, and they kind of failed. So, and now there's a new effort. So it's not because I think it's not appropriate, but there are political difficulties, and that's to some extent the problem. But also, I think in terms, Domagoj already mentioned that narrowing the price gap is possible, but you can't overcome the price gap. So it will remain, and to put a little bit figure to, or flesh to the bones, my colleagues looked at current fossil fuel prices. They are around 500 euro per ton, and the carbon price adds 250 euro per ton, the current carbon price. But the biofuels is around 1,500 euro per ton. Ammonia is almost 2,000 euro per ton, and methanol 2,500 euro per ton. So there is still a price gap of several factors, basically. And so that is clear that carbon pricing, at least right now, is not the instrument who really drives the change, the transition. So we need a policy mix. I think that's an important message. I think you said that as well, implicitly, but I think we need a combination of policies, a global fuel standard, which is focusing on technical incentives for technical measures on the ships and in the ports as well. But then carbon pricing supports it, and carbon pricing can, in addition, as you mentioned, that also generate revenues, which then can be used to support the transition on ships and harbors. Thank you.
That's really useful. I'm going to come back to a couple of those points, I
Yeah,
think.
sure.
But I'd like to move a little bit to talk about like sort of observations from practical implementation and touch on something you said, and I think to Micah in particular, in terms of, you have a lot of experience in terms of regulating companies generally under the EU ETS. Keen for your observations on shipping in that frame, and if there's any sort of differences with shipping from other industries. But also to touch on a point that Martin said in terms of multiple policies in targeting mitigation in this industry. So in particular, the EU ETS and the greenhouse gas fuel standard. So any sort of reflections on those topics would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Because that's what we are looking upon. We are, as a supervising institution, also looking at feasibility. And the main difference between the maritime sector and what we're used to is the international component, which we're also used to with aviation, of course. However, for maritime, it's far more dynamic. For example, owner structures are far more dynamic. And what I hear from when I speak to shipping companies, I think the most of them, they are really willing to be compliant, but they're also a bit worried that not everyone is just as willing to be compliant, and that we, as supervising institutions and authorities, are not capable of enforcement. So level playing field, I think that is more of a question than in the ETS 1. And as it's been told also on several stages today, trust in the system. I think it's very it's necessary to make the ETS work. so we as authorities have a lot to do on this issue, working together with our authorities abroad. I think that is one of the main issues. And the second is, because, well, actually, this is the first year. So this is our first year that we actually receive what we call these monitoring plans, which are well, maybe the cookery books, how shipping companies can come to an emission report in the end. Well, what we observe, apparently it's kind of hard for the shipping companies to make them well, compliant in ones. And that's not so surprising, I guess. We've seen that with ETS1 as well. It takes time to come to perfect data.
And so is that in terms of it's difficult or complex to track the fuel? Is that
well, it's kind of difficult and complex to meet all the demands that is set in the MRV. And I see it's quite broad. So, but then again, we have had that experience with ETS1 as well. So it wasn't the great instrument from the start as it is right now. So I think we also need to take some time. And you also asked me about the policy mix.
Oh yes, and the fuel standards.
The NEA, the Dutch Emission Authority, is also supervising the Fuel EU. So the European instrument that it aims at setting regulation on the fuel itself and the CO2 density. And I think, well, I don't have a lot to add. I think it's a good extra instrument which aims more at this fuel supply itself. So I think it's an extra plus for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a quick add to that.
Yeah, please.
To the first part, to the monitoring. I remember that the monitoring guidelines in the UETS were only adapted after the becoming into force of the ETS.
ETS1.
Yeah, ETS1. So it took some time, and so I think it's quite natural that at the beginning you have some adjustment time, both for authorities, for the entities who are covered by the regulation. So I wouldn't be too worried.
No, that's what I try to. That's my message. I'm not really worried. It's what we see, and it just takes some time. And if I may add on the Fuel EU, also there's this feasibility element. I think it's an excellent instrument. However, on more practical sides, demands on reporting are not the same. So I think for shipping companies, things might be fixed a bit easier in the administrative burden.
So super interesting, and I would like to come to you, Sarah, to see firsthand what your experience has been with MRV over the last few years, the complexity, but also the comment around wanting to have, like, I guess, fair competition and having been applied. And I've heard similar things when I was a policymaker, that you don't care so much about having the regulation as long as everyone else has the same regulation. So. Any perspectives?
The trust issue is quite critical, because I think shipping industry failed through trust over the last years, and the ETS was good because through regulation you cannot fail it. You have to trust the system. When the regulations come in, I think that you can trust, and then you know that the rules apply for all the players in the market. I'm representing the maritime shipping company, but I mean, compared to of course, the big carriers, our size is much smaller. And of course, I mean, we are running on high risks through these upcoming regulations. We are a non-EU based company. We are in competition with the top 5 big carriers in the geographical area that we serve. And our biggest trading partner is the EU. So, I mean, majority of our cargo is subject to these regulations and the taxations. Fuel EU will be bringing much additional cost on our shoulders for sure. Martin touched upon the alternative fuels. For that, unfortunately, I mean, we cannot really talk about hydrogen or ammonia in this stage because they are still on the very early stages. I mean, the supply is not there, the distribution is not there. But I think Fuel EU may also assist for an increased production on the e-fuels as well, because this is going to be related to the directly type of fuel that we will be using. And what I can tell is, generally speaking, I think next year is going to be much more challenging than this year, because the ETS amount will increase up to 70%. Fuel EU Maritime will be introduced, and the whole Mediterranean area will be ECA, so emission control area, meaning that we also reduce down our sulfur to 0.1, lower, like, I mean, it's basically zero. So this is going to be, I mean, we are also dealing with huge investment costs, and the critical question is, okay, now we budgeted for the ETS this year, and we put a markup on the ocean freight, okay? And this was announced to all the customers, and they accepted it. But frankly speaking, in some areas where the freight levels go down, that's the ETS share may disappear. You know, it's actually a minus on the shipping line, whereas it's a cost for us. I mean, this year was okay, but when we have this additional costs coming up, and okay, we have some, of course, running on some alternative scenarios like biofuel. We have produced the first biofuel. Our sister company, I4C Bunker, produced the first biofuel in Turkey with the I4C certificate, and we started deploying, testing on our vessels. So for sure, we will be increasing the usage of biofuel next year, but it's not going to be sufficient. I mean, we know that in the Mediterranean and the other areas, we cannot find the supply anywhere that we go. So I mean, these are some of the challenges, the upcoming challenges. But I think we can overcome the trust through regulations. I mean, this is my perception.
Okay, there's two things I wanted to come back onto. One was fuel, and the other one was cost. So I might come to you in a second on cost, but just because fuel, the price and the role of carbon pricing in the cost differential between biofuels and regular fuels has come up a couple of times. So Martin, you've done a lot of research on this, and you've talked about the numbers already, and there's a gap. So I'm keen to hear a little bit more about what role you think carbon pricing has, in particular, in the commercialization, or also the development of the actual fuel, the availability of the fuel as well, and then the price differential as well, and then also maybe other instruments that are necessary complements to sort of bridge that gap as well.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the contribution of carbon pricing is actually the minor share in triggering or the transition towards sustainable fuels in the maritime sector. As I already illustrated, the price gap is so large that you can't, with current carbon market prices, you can't trigger the transition. You need an additional instrument. And I think this is also independent of the type of fuel, I think. But there, I think we also need some flexibility within the mechanisms. The EU has some flexibility. You can group different ships, and then they can comply together to the requirements. And then within the EU, IMO, MEPC, the discussion, there is also the idea to increase the flexibility, so that you kind of build in some carbon market into a fuel standard. So the fuel standard is not a pure technical policy. It's a combination of technical requirements together with built-in flexibility in terms of compliance. And so this is not directly carbon pricing, but a carbon market element, at least, in that. And then the part of carbon pricing, I think, is raise revenues. In the IMO, there are two instruments in discussion. One is a GFS, a greenhouse gas fuel standard, and the other one is a levy tax, so it's not finally decided, and it's even more disputed than the technical policy. But the second one is not to control emissions, I would say, in my assessment, but to raise revenues. And with the revenues, then you can also support either ship owners who use the fuels, or ports, or fuel suppliers. So that would trigger, I think, and the transition. Yeah. One thing, we may come back to that, I think still is we do have 3 or 4 different fuels in the market. And I think that is, at least in my perspective, a challenge because from the infrastructure and from the ships, they are not interchangeable. So you kind of lock into one fuel, and if we have globally 3 or 4 different fuels, we have a quite different situation than we have today, where we have just almost 99% of or one fuel. So,
yeah, okay, that's an interesting challenge I wasn't aware of. So now switching a little bit to the price increases as a result. I mean, that's the whole point of carbon pricing, is to put a price incentive. At a higher level, trying to work out what that means, and for companies, but also for countries. And so there's the principle of a just and equitable transition in terms of global mitigation and global decarbonisation. How has this been applied in the international shipping industry, particularly in terms of how it's incorporated into the EU ETS, but also maybe in terms of the negotiations at the IMO?
I think it's an interesting question, because this is something, as Martin mentioned previously, the discussion about carbon pricing at the IMO go back over a decade. The issues about just and equitable and related concepts to just and equitable, such as no country left behind, or CBDRRC, carbon differentiated responsibilities, which are, related types of concepts have been discussed within the IMO for over a decade. Having said that, I should caveat this: these are fundamentally different concepts. They're not the same, and there's been a lot of disagreement between IMO member states about how do we implement these principles, which principles we should go by. But the fundamental issue is that the fundamental kind of underlying issue is that the transition will be costly, as you mentioned, and that the transition will require some form of compromise to be made, who will actually pay for it and who will bear the consequences of it. And this is where this just and equitable concept comes through. Now, at the moment, the IMO is doing a lot of work trying to understand what are these negative impacts on states, which ones are disproportionate, and how much will this be costly from that perspective. The 2023 GHG strategy from the IMO has included the just and equitable principle in its vision, in the vision of any new type of, that should guide the development of these midterm measures. So from that perspective, from an IMO perspective, what will be interesting to see is how is it actually included in those measures. And as was mentioned previously, it will be the mixture of measures. It will be the carbon pricing measure together with a fuel standard that will actually be a way of implementing it. So there have been discussions around the flexibility mechanism, around being flexible with these types of issues, similar to the EU ETS, but also looking at other types of areas. So can you be flexible in the way that these measures are implied, whether it includes certain routes, excludes certain routes, whether it includes certain types of ships, or whether it allows you that combination of ships and routes where you can actually do it. Some of the aspects that are going to be quite important is, coming back to that, disproportionately negative impacts on states. How do you define which countries, which regions, which routes can we be flexible with? Is that to do with the basis of some countries just having significantly higher trade costs because of this increase. Some small island developing nations, or at least developed countries, should they have some certain preferences as well because they're so far from their end markets or from where they're actually importing food and goods to support their communities and their economic growth? Should it also look at the countries that have a lot of trade that will be most negatively impacted, as some countries seem to say? So there's a lot of combinations that have to be looked at. So from a geographical perspective, I think trade impacts and impacts on countries that are most vulnerable from a climate position and from a distance to those end markets and from their economic development will be key. And then also just and equitable can be looked at from the concept of communities and the concept of seafarers. So which communities locally or regionally in certain countries might be impacted, whether those are port communities of certain types of regional aspects or some indigenous communities that might be impacted. And from a seafarer perspective, what does this mean from a perspective of just and equitable for the transition for the seafarer? So having those funds available to support all of these aspects, I think, will be key. And this is where a carbon pricing mechanism, I think, can support greatly, as was mentioned previously, to actually use that money to see, once we agree at the IMO level, where do we want to use those funds, and then seeing how can we actually position them to streamline this transition. Because having said all of that, someone will have to pay for that transition, and aspects of that will necessitate that certain aspects of trade will become costlier. Certain segments of the industry or certain countries will be affected. It's about choosing or deciding where does that level go over what is actually manageable, and where do we actually have to pull those resources together.
So super interesting. It seems like there's a lot of lenses that you have to look through, and there's options as to where you want to, for example, compensate. But one thing that struck me, that the flexibility that you may want to introduce could potentially increase the complexity, right? Like there's sort of like almost a double-edged sword in terms of maybe not just implementation, but also in terms of, for example, distribution of revenue. Do you think that's an issue, or is that manageable?
I think it is an issue. I think it's an issue from two lenses. First of all, from the administrative issue of the more complexity you have, the more difficult it is to administer this system. But then also from the perspective of explaining it to the industry, explaining it to the policymakers, explaining it locally to communities, the more flexibility it is, the more difficult it becomes. But I guess there's a trade-off at the level of flexibility you want, and how do you do it. And many things at the IMO, that the way that they happen is they go through rounds and rounds of negotiations, as was in with the sulfur cap and so forth, and development of the emission control areas. So eventually a trade-off between flexibility, between complexity and between actually having that flexibility of implementing those measures becomes key. So I think we do not want perfection to overcome a measure that can actually work and that can be done, even though it might be rough around the edges at certain areas, but it will be key what happens at MEPC, in the Marine Environment Protection meetings, in a few weeks' time, and then coming into 25. That will be key to actually see how some of these issues are resolved.
Okay, that's a perfect segue, I think, to the last question before we go to the audience. So if you were to give, in the context of the IMO negotiations, if you were able to give negotiators or policymakers in that room one piece of advice, what would it be? So I might start with Martin. And in the context of everything that you've researched and everything that you know about the shipping and carbon pricing and IMO negotiations, what would be the one piece of advice?
Yeah, mainly I think within the EU we are almost done. I think we need to review, but I think we are very good on track from a policy perspective and for the IMO. I think the discussions are, there's a good mood, and I would recommend to pursue this mood and to establish or to develop those policies which are currently discussed. As I mentioned before, the technical measures, the fuel standard together with a carbon pricing mechanism to raise revenues, and I think this is a good way, particularly because I think they avoided the challenge 10 years ago, or where also offsetting was so having credits from other sectors. And I think it's important that there was a clear decision to be to achieve the reduction within the sector without offsetting from other sectors.
Excellent. Sarah?
Yeah. So on top of what Martin said, we are also following this next meeting of MEPC, which is going to be in 3 weeks or so. We know that UN Trade and Development, together with the DNME, is also working on several scenarios with the combination of 16 policies, 32 different scenarios. So I think this is going to be a quite, let's say, good outcome, because they're considering so many scenarios, including the different type of e-fuels, the carbon capture, all the upcoming technologies which are not present today. So I think this perception and strategy is quite good, which should be there. If it wasn't, it might be something that I would add on. But I also think that, of course, I mean, the ETS is only valid for this limited geographical area. The IMO regulations is valid over all industry, so it's going to involve cross countries. So it should have, it should be again have a certain flexibility and adaptability in order to okay, we will have the measures and standards there too, but in order to apply the whole countries and make sure no one's left behind. So this would be my.
Okay, maybe. Thank you. And Tomogoy?
I think what's key from our research and from what we've seen in this kind of midterm adoption of scalable zero-emission fuels is lack of regulatory certainty and understanding where can we get that regulatory certainty. I think that's where the IMO can play a key role. So not just ensuring that those midterm measures are adopted and that are adopted at time, at pace, as is planned at the moment, but also ensuring that whichever measures or whichever basket of measures that are on the table at the moment are adopted, that those measures also ensure an idea of how will they actually support adoption of fuels by 2030, by the early 2030s, moving forward from there. So taking into consideration that they will only come into force 27 or afterwards, but understanding that once we know what they are, is that there's a clear route how they can actually support adoption of those zero-emission fuels, whether that's through using money from funds from the carbon pricing scheme, or whether that's another combination of measures. But a clear path forward is necessary from a regulatory certainty perspective, just to ensure that we know, not just in the long term what the decarbonization plan is, but how does it affect these early movers and the early adoptions, so that those investments that we see floating around are actually made and concretely anchored, so to say.
Excellent. And Micah?
Last one.
Yeah.
Well, in extra of what is said by all of you, I would also recommend to make use as much as possible of the systems and the knowledge is there. So don't make an MRV that's just a little bit different, please. Make use of all the reports that are that you already have to deliver to all the authorities. It can make life so much easier for us, but most of all for you.
Yeah.
That's simple, but
simple,
sound.
yes.
I think very good closing point.
Yes. Good. So with that, maybe we could open the floor, see if there's any questions from anyone in the audience. Oh, there's one up the front. There's two here. Maybe we'll take these two questions and then get some responses.
Hi, my name is Christian Bruning, advisor to Environmental Commodities. It's a fund in the US. We are looking at some investments in the maritime sector. I have two quick questions, one for Sarah. If we put aside the fact that the voluntary market is somewhat subdued at the moment, there are 4 methodologies in the voluntary, under gold standard for the maritime sector. How do you view the likelihood of clients, either upstream or downstream, being interested in you essentially undertaking some measures under a voluntary standard and buying those at a significant premium to current voluntary prices? Second question to Micah. Onshore power is required in the EUTS or in the EU, is it the refuel directive, 100% by 2030? I think there's about 300 megawatts now, and it's about 6 terawatts that are required. How is that going to work without carbon capture, either onshore or some kind of intermediate solutions at ports in Europe?
So I might take one more question.
Yes, I wanted to know how much are you looking at negative spillovers in other sectors? Because when in Mexico bunker oil was being moved away, what happened is that the state-owned petroleum company began to sell it to the utilities, and then it was very, very dirty air around the electricity generation, just because there was this fuel that could not go anywhere. How much are you looking at those connections between sectors that are clearly not maritime?
So we might go in the order in which they came. I don't know, Sarah, did you want to respond to the first question on voluntary standards?
Yeah. So, I mean, thank you for this question, because this is also on our agenda, and we are quite positive on the inclusion of voluntary market in our system. So, in the maritime shipping, it works through a book and claim, and now, for instance, this year we are using some biofuel in our vessels, but we are not. I mean, this is the cost. The additional cost is all on our shoulders. So, in case we can work on this voluntary market solution through this book and claim system, then we can also ask our customers, whoever wants to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, to contribute and have a share on the alternative fuel, biofuel that we're using. And apparently we will start to increase the usage of biofuel over the course of next year and the years to come. So, I mean, this is also quite critical, so that we go into this quite soon. There are 3 major carriers who are already applying this in their system. In our side, I don't know any company, but I mean, because we are also pioneering this usage of biofuel in our country, for sure it's quite important that we at least, we don't know how much we can collect from the clients, but before introducing this in our system to our network, of course it's difficult, and I strongly believe that it's going to increase in the coming years, because there's also pressure on all manufacturers, etc., in order to reduce emissions. I hope it's clear.
Micah, do you want to?
Well, first of all, I have to admit I'm not really the Dutch expert of onshore power, but I know this is a huge challenge, of course, and not only for onshore power. We have this major challenge, electrifying and making the infrastructure work. So I think it's something that we need to deal also with the government to make things ready and have this infrastructure ready. That's it for now.
So the question on spillovers, which I think is a good one, and there's probably a few ways that this could be the case in terms of modal transport as well as fuels and like. I don't know if maybe Martin or Domagoj, did you want to have a first crack at this, either of you?
I guess I could offer some perspectives from our end. So one way that you could look at the spillovers issue is the pace of the transition in different regions and in different countries. So the worry is that if the transition happens faster in, let's say, more developed countries, you will have the spillover of some vessels being sold over to some countries where the pollution actually increases because you're actually using those HFOs or those distillates for longer in some areas because it's more expensive. And I guess that's where the overlap between just and equitable comes into play. From the perspective of the transition as a whole and where will these fuels go on, I mean, at the moment, shipping is really using those fuels that are, as is often said, at the bottom of the barrel. So where will they continue if you're decarbonizing other sectors? Hopefully, that there's not many places that they can go to. So that's something where it's important to actually include this as a systems-based transition, not just decarbonizing shipping. You're doing it as part of a wider decarbonization goal of the entire energy system to be decarbonized. So that's something that's quite important. And it will become more important now that shipping will be using, hopefully, in the future, these hydrogen-derived fuels, which have to be produced together, not just for shipping, but for other sectors. Because if you're creating that synthetic methanol or that green ammonia, well, you have to have the hydrogen, sustainable hydrogen pathway for production that will be used by other sectors as well. That you're not taking away hydrogen that would be used for other purposes. And it's quite important to ensure that well-to-wake, so the entire life cycle of the development of that fuel is green, is sustainable. That you're not just transferring the emissions somewhere else, which is something that the IMO is trying to assure with the well-to-wake approach as well.
Excellent. I think we're at time, unless there's any burning questions from the audience. I don't see any. So thank you very much, all four of you. I won't try and summarize, but my key takeaways in terms of what I learned today were, I think, that the need to leverage existing MRV, I think that's a key takeaway for me. The need for a broader sectoral approach to avoid spillovers. And I think a lot of these lessons, for me, they apply not just in the maritime sector, but beyond as well. And then some other themes that came through were in relation to ensuring carbon pricing in the maritime sector, but I think beyond as well is trustworthy, fair, so applied equally across entities, and that there is an element of regulatory certainty there. And I think for a carbon price and to be able to work, companies need to know what the expectations are to be able to plan and manage that over time. So please join me in thanking the panelists, and thanks everyone for attending.